And I think Nietzsche and Hegel are very, very close on this. I think Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche is absolutely wrong. Because Nietzsche doesn't just say that God dies, he says the moral God dies. The God that dies in Nietzsche is the same as Hegel's bad infinite, right? And in Hegel, the death of that bad infinite leads to is a critique of the notion of desire that you're talking about, because there's an infinity of desires that keeps going on, but that leads to a different kind of notion of the divine as this imminent kind of process, which is in a certain sense is a certain kind of re-enchantment, so that the death of the transcendent God leads to an immanentization, which is a re-enchantment of precisely this kind of process. And there's something very, very similar going on to that, it seems to me, in Nietzsche. And it's that notion, I mean, in this country, the major figure in the death of God theology in the 60s was Tom Altizer. And what Tom does is basically to develop a critique of the transcendent God, which at that time was the neo-orthodox God of Karl Barth, influenced by Heidegger in certain ways, through what he identifies as a process of kenosis, drawing on Hegel, Nietzsche, and Blake, to a certain kind of re-enchantment where the divine disappears in a certain way by becoming so transcendent that it disappears, or so immanent that everything becomes divine. And so there's a notion of the death of God. There is a certain kind of nihilism in that. But as you know, in Nietzsche, there's sort of a good nihilism and a bad nihilism, as it were. And the good nihilism, we use that, it's not a good word, but is tied to a certain kind of understanding of the death of God, which leads to something that's. Now, the interesting question is one I wrestle with all the time, it seems to me. I mean, as you know, in Positions, in one of the interviews in Positions, Derrida says, we'll never be done with the reading and rereading of Hegel, and in a certain sense, I've done nothing else than explain myself on that. The interesting question is the relationship between the Hegelian good infinite and the kind of notion of transitional matrix, or that milieu that you're after. And they're very close to seeming, but not quite the same. So the point is, it seems to me that in thinking through the relationship of this to nihilism on the one hand, death of God on one hand, nihilism on the other, there's a way in which both nihilism and the death of God reinforce precisely the kind of decision it seems that you want to come out at.
I agree with you completely for all those remarks, and particularly I disagree with Deleuze in his reading of Nietzsche in respect to Hegel, in the relationship between Hegel and Nietzsche. Now, I think also that nevertheless it is very interesting to follow Deleuze about the question of belief and of not exactly a question of good nihilism, as you said, it is an expression and not satisfying. But I think Deleuze nevertheless tried to open this question of the good nihilism or the good infinite, or in a good way. Now, the problem is, for myself, with Hegel, in fact, my first philosopher was Hegel, because...
everybody's first philosopher.
Yes, I agree. Now, the problem for me, as I said this afternoon, very briefly, in the seminar, is it's not possible to think in an economy of tendencies with Hegel for me. Dialectic is not an economy of tendencies. And consequently, it's not possible to make with dialectic a pharmacology. And on the contrary, Nietzsche is completely a pharmacological force.
Can you have a pharmacology without a dialectic?
I think the question is, what is dialectic?
where Derrida works out the notion of the pharmacological, it is it is, in a certain sense, interior to dialectic, at least in the essay Plato's Pharmacy.
Yeah. Now the dialectics, Hegelian dialectic, is necessarily without transitional object, because the transitional object is not synthesizable, and it is a technical object, an artifact. That, I think, with Hegel, it's not possible to solve it, and not to solve it, but to integrate it in this circle.
Am I mistaken? You're using the transitional object as something very close to difference, right?
Very close to what?
Difference.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the question then becomes, there is not the pharmacon is not in Hegel as Hegel intends to articulate it. But of course, the whole argument of Plato's Pharmacy is that the phenomenology of spirit is a pharmacon.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now, with this pharmacology of Plato, with the Derridian pharmacology, for myself, there is a problem. What is the problem? It is that in my reading, maybe I'm wrong, but in my reading of Derrida, I never found something about the question of therapeutics.
About what?
Therapeutics.
Yeah.
And what is at stake in Phaedrus and in the whole work of Plato, in fact, at the end? It is philosophy as therapeutics against the poisonous use of pharmacon by sophistry. Now, the critique of Derrida against Plato is this position, which is an opposition between the pharmacon and philosophy, is a metaphysical position. So we need to leave this position. Now, I agree with him about that. On the contrary, if you read, for example, Léon Robin, a reader of Plato in the 20s, the 20th century, he says, what was the academy? It was a place for producing books and for invading the city, the police, with those books, you know. And in fact, it was a kind of therapeutic, of therapeutic. Now, this question is never explored and critiqued as such by Derrida. And I think with Hegel, there is also a question, because the pharmacon as such meaning for me as it is artifactual, disposable, material, etc., contingent, is not what is. It's not possible that it is the origin of the idealism. You know? And this is a question for me. And here, the most important thinker in philosophy is Nietzsche, and the most important scientist is Freud, opening the question as such. But Freud himself can't think as a pharmacon.
One last question, I'll stop because it's fascinating. And again, it's a theological. I mean, I like to talk about theology. I think Freud's theological in his own as well, but that's another story. I think you're right on this question of therapeutics. Now let me try to phrase this, because the category of kenosis is a thoroughly Christological category, Christian therefore. I always read Nietzsche and Hegel and Nietzsche as radical Christians in that sense. Is it possible that the apparent lack of a therapeutic, to use that word, in Derrida, is tied to a certain kind of Judaism at work in him, as distinct from this kind of canonic notion of Christology in